So, as we are starting this new year, there's probably a lot of emotions going through our minds, our hearts, as we just went through several big holidays within a short amount of time. Time with family, time with friends, and now there's nothing for a little bit. I mean, yes, there is Valentine's Day coming up, but that's more than a month away. Which the funny thing is, last week, back when it was still December, I went to the store and I already found that there was already Valentine's Day decorations and candies out. And I'm like, we're not even into the new year yet. Where's the New Year's decorations? And but even with this transition, there's still some memories that we can keep with us. And over the time with Christmas, as we took a look at the songs of Christmas, even though we didn't look at actual Christmas carols or fun Christmas music, that's always one of the joys that I appreciate during that season. One particular song that I've enjoyed listening to is the song Mary Did You Know? In this song, it talks about how people are asking Mary questions. Hey, did you know that this baby you're holding is the son of God? That this little baby, he's going to walk on water, that he'll give sight to the blind, he'll calm the storms with his hands, and several other things. And the last thing that we see in this song, the last line, which is, and the sleeping child you are holding is the great I am. This year, we're going to be looking at various different topics, but they all come to the same theme, which is understanding who is Jesus. That's going to be our big theme for 2025. Understanding the question, who is Jesus? And to start off with 2025, we're going to be taking a look at the I am statements of Jesus. We're going to be taking a look at all these statements, and they're found in the Gospel of John. There's seven to be exact, but we're going to be looking at a couple others throughout this series to understand more of who is Jesus. And so today we're actually not going to be looking at the book of John, but we're looking at Exodus chapter 3, where we see a very important I am statement. So again, we're looking at the book of Exodus. So a little bit of a background on this particular book before we get into the text today. So the book of Exodus, this is a part of the Torah, as we see in the Hebrew culture, or what we call the Pentateuch. Both are referring to the same thing. It's the law. This is the first five books of the Bible, the first five books of the Old Testament. So we got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those five books are the Pentateuch, and all of them were written by Moses. And they were written around 1450 to 1410 BC. And for the book of Exodus, the main theme is the deliverance from Egypt and the giving of the Ten Commandments. So that's just a little bit of a background to the book of Exodus. So now getting into the main text, the first thing we see is Moses in Midian, which this is literally just the first verse of chapter 3, which says this. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. So Moses, just a little background on Moses on how he got to Midian. So in chapter 2, we find out that Moses, so he grew up in the palace. If you remember the classic story where he's actually born Hebrew, but then Pharaoh gave the order to kill all the Hebrew babies who are 2 and under. And his mother, Moses' mother, then took him and placed him in a basket, put him in the Nile River to hide Moses. And then Pharaoh's daughter comes out to bathe at the Nile River and then sees this basket, opens it up, finds this baby. And that's where Moses gets his name, Moses, because she drew him out of the water. And then Moses, he lived in the palace for 40 years. And after that time, Moses, he eventually, by that time, he found out he was Hebrew himself. We're not sure how, but he just found out that he was Hebrew. And one day he saw an Egyptian um, abusing another Hebrew. And so then Moses went to that Egyptian and even killed him, buried him in the desert. And then eventually he got caught and found out um, that Moses killed this guy, and then Moses then fled to Midian, which then during that time there, he became a shepherd and he got married, as we see here that he married one of Jethro's daughters. And so now he becomes a shepherd. And so something unique about Moses' life. So he eventually lived 120 years, and you can literally divide those 40 years equally. So the 120 years equally. He spent 40 years in the palace of Egypt, then he spent another 40 years as a shepherd in Midian, and then he spent the last 40 years as the leader of the Hebrews. And so so with Exodus chapter 3, where he's now about 80 years old. So he just spent 80 years, or I'm sorry, he spent 40 years in Midian as a shepherd. And so again, that's our first point today. So Moses and Midian. So now our second point, we see Moses in front of the fire. So starting in verse 2, there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn. I mean, how many of us have seen something on fire, but it was not burning? That's a strange sight to see. So when you see that, it's like, I gotta investigate what is going on here. So then continuing on in verse 4, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Verse 5, do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Verse 6, then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And continuing on, verse 7. Then the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because they're slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So then, so we see here, God is saying to Moses, I have chosen you to be my leader for the Hebrews, to bring them out of Egypt. Their suffering is now done. But I need you to lead them. I need you to go back to Egypt, the place that you just came from 40 years ago. I want you to go back. Now, for Moses, he was not exactly wanting to do this right away. He was like, wait a second, God, I don't want to do this. It's like, who am I to do this? Who am I? Like, I'm not a great leader, Lord. But God is saying, I will be with you. I'm sorry, in verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Verse 12. And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign for you, or sign to you, that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God in this on this mountain. So God is trying to tell Moses, hey, I'll be with you. You're not going by yourself. I'm going to be with you the entire way. And so Moses is trying to understand here of like, wait a second. I tried this before. I tried to lead the Israelites before. I tried to be their leader 40 years ago, but that didn't exactly work out. But now it is time for him to go and be the leader of the Hebrews. But Moses is not exactly 100% sure about this yet. So he still asks another question, trying to understand what's going on here. So this becomes our third point, which this is where we're going to be spending the most time in this morning. So in verse 13, this is where we see God reveals himself. Verse 13, it says, Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? So in verse 13, this is a unique question. It's an unusual question because, see, God has already revealed himself to him in terms of who he is, that he is the one true God. See, earlier in the text, in verses 4 through 6, God has already said, number one, you are standing on holy ground. And in verse 6, it says, then he said, as in God, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So Moses understands that he's talking to God. He's talking to the one true God. But if he's to go to the Israelites and say, hey, God has sent me. God has sent me to you to lead you out. But Moses is saying, like, what if I go to them and tell them this, but they ask me, what is his name? Who is this God that has sent you? See, Moses just wanted to make sure if the Israelites are going to ask the name of God, that he's going to give the proper name. See, the Israelites, the Hebrews, they don't want the new trendy God. They don't want the newest God. And also, Moses spent 40 years in the palace. And how many gods do they have? They had several different gods. And so he just wanted to make sure that he's presenting his name properly, that Moses is going to tell them who God truly is, the God of the Hebrews. So then with that, we get into verse 14, which says, God said to Moses, I am who I am. That's a unique name, isn't it? I am who I am. Now, this might sound like he's not giving a proper name, that God's not giving a good name of who he is. But the thing is, God can use this name, this particular name, because God is describing of who he is. See, God is self-identifying. God is defining of who he is. He is self-identifying. God is saying, I am me. But the thing is, God is the only one who can do that. Is the only one who can self-identify. See, if you go to the DMV, and let's say you have to change your address, and I've had to do this a couple of times over the last few years just because of moving a lot. And when you go to the DMV, you can't just say like, oh yeah, I moved to a new address and here's my address, so I just need you to update my driver's license. That's not exactly going to work. You got to prove that you are you. And then you also got to prove that you're at this new address. So what you got to do, you got to show, here's my current driver's license, and here's a couple bills that I received at this new address, and here's some other paperwork. And so like you got to prove to the DMV that you're you, but then you're also at this new address. But for God, he's saying, I am me. But God is the only one who can say that. But then we continue on in verse 14, which says, this is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. Now, again, this name sounds really weird. Like, it's like, how can you just say, I am has sent you? And so when we take a look at this name, I am, we see I as in a first person pronoun, but then we see am, which is a third person, as in present tense. You see, what's interesting here is that the name I am, when it's translated, it actually is Yahweh, which means he is. See, God is saying, I am, as in I am present. That's my name. I am present, as in he is. See, when we're describing ourselves, we might describe it such as in a past tense, we would say, I was, or present tense, I am, and then in future tense, I want to be. But with here, God is saying he is always present tense. So again, for us, we would say, I was, I am, I want to be. But for God, he's saying, I am, I am, I am, as in he just simply is. And so this name, Yahweh, it's 4 letters. So it's YHWH. That's the Hebrew spelling. See, there's no vowels in Hebrew. So that's why it's only consonants that we see here. Now, the name Yahweh, it's such a holy name. It's such a great name in the Hebrew, in the Jewish culture, that you're not allowed to say Yahweh. That's how holy it is. In fact, when you take a look at the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, you don't see Yahweh in there. You see a different name. You see Adonai. Now, Adonai and Yahweh both mean the same thing. It means Lord. In fact, when you take a look at the text and take a look at our Bibles here today, when you see the word Lord in all caps, that means that's for us Yahweh or Adonai, as the Hebrews would say it. In fact, we even see this in verse 15 at the beginning. It says, God said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord. See, the word Lord, that's in all caps. That's Yahweh. That's Adonai. Now, just a little bit of understanding of the name is that over the years, so because of the name Yahweh, since it was so holy, so sacred, they weren't allowed to say it. And so they say Adonai. And so to make sure that no one says Yahweh, they take different symbols. They take various vowel markings from the word Adonai and put them in Yahweh. It's to make sure who's ever reading the text that they don't say Yahweh, that they say Adonai instead. Again, it's because the name Yahweh is so holy, they have to say Adonai. See, Adonai is a more general term. It still means God. It still means Lord, the one true God, but it's not Yahweh. Now, the little extra history lesson for us is that eventually along the years when the Bible was translated from the original text into English, the translators did not fully understand that that's what the Hebrews did, that they took extra markings, like they took the vowel marks from Adonai and put them into Yahweh. And so they just thought, oh, that's how the word is supposed to be spelled. And so for us in English, we would hear the word Jehovah. We thought that was the original name of God, meaning, again, all those mean the same thing. It still means Lord, but for us in English, we might use the word Jehovah. Again, still meaning Yahweh, still meaning God. And so then again, continuing on in verse 15, it says, God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be represented, remembered, and from generations to generations. So taking a look at the understanding of I am looking over through the generation through generations, we understand that this name was never used except by one other person. There was one other person in history who referred to himself as I am. Anyone want to take a guess of who that person is? It was Jesus. We see this in John chapter 8. In fact, this is a little sneak peek into our series. I'm actually going to be doing a much bigger message on this later on in our series, but just a little sneak peek. We see this here in John chapter 8. We see, starting in verse 54. Now keep your finger in Exodus 3. We'll come back to that. But again, John chapter 8, starting in verse 54. Jesus replied, if I am glorified, Jesus replied, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar to you. Or I'll be a liar like you. But I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. Verse 57. You are not yet 50 years old, the Jews said to him, and you have seen Abraham? Verse 58. I tell you the truth, Jesus answered. Before Abraham was born, I am. At this, they picked up stones to stone him. So who did Jesus claim to be? Jesus just said, I am Yahweh. Jesus just not only used the name of God that you are not allowed to use, but he claimed to be Yahweh himself. And that is why people did not like Jesus. People didn't like Jesus because he claimed to be God. Now, there are people that say, well, Jesus just taught to be a nice person. How many people do you know got killed because they just said, be a nice person? In fact, if Jesus just said, just be nice, be good to others, love your neighbor, then why did the Jews want to kill him? It's because he claimed to be God. That's the reason. In fact, later on in the book of John, we actually see this, where Jesus is asking the Jewish people, it's like, why are you mad? It's like, you've seen what I've done. Why are you upset? And the Jews replied, it is not because of those things you have done, but it's because you claim to be God. And that's the only reason. And just this understanding of who God is, of who I am is, of who is Yahweh. He is self-existing. He is self-dependent. See, Jesus is not only using the name of Yahweh, but he's also using it to describe himself, that he is self-dependent, that God is self-dependent, that he's always been existing. Again, he's not dependent on anyone. See, God does not need us to survive. Now, some people believe that God needs us humans in order to thrive, but that's not the case. See, us humans, we're dependent on a few things, such as water, food, shelter, maybe some money along the way just to pay for things. See, we're dependent on those things. We're dependent on various things. But God doesn't live in that realm. God is not dependent on us. But also, God is always existing. God has always existed. In fact, we even see an example of this in the very first verse of Scripture. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, the first four words of Scripture says, "In the beginning, God." I'm going to say that again. In the beginning, God. God was in the beginning before the beginning. So that means God has always existed. That he is. He's was there. But he is there. Because that's who Jesus claimed to be, that he is Yahweh, that he was there at the beginning. That he himself is Yahweh. And so then continuing on, looking at the rest of this chapter, so verses 16 through 22, where we see God instructs Moses. He said, so starting in verse 16, "Go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done in Egypt." Verse 17, "And I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt, into the land of the Canaanites, Hivites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey." And then God continues on to say, "Go get the elders and instruct them of what they were going to be doing, and how Moses was going to bring the bring the Israelites out of Egypt and strike the hands of the Egyptians." That was God's instructions for Moses to bring them out. And so then looking at our application, we got four things to look into today. The first one is Yahweh is always existing. God had always been existing. His name, I am, as in he is. He is always present. He is present tense. That he is never changing. In fact, we even see this in Hebrews chapter 13, where it talks about how Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And to understand that, we just saw that Jesus claimed to be Yahweh. Oh, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I mean, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Yahweh is not dependent on us. Friends, we're dependent on various things. We need water, we need food, shelter, we need various things to just simply survive. I'm not saying we need a smartphone to survive. I'm not saying that, but we just need the basic necessities to survive, to function. God is not the same way. God does not thrive in the same way as we do. God is self-existing. God is self-dependent. And then also we see Jesus is Yahweh. See, some people have said that Jesus never said once, "I am God, bow down and worship me." Jesus never said that anywhere in the Bible. But we have to understand that during this time, during biblical times, God was never referred to as God. He is referred to as Yahweh. That was his name. That's who he was referred to as. So by understanding the context, his name, who God is, we can see that Jesus clearly claimed to be God. He claimed to be Yahweh. That's why people picked up stones to stone him, because he claimed to be God. But then finally, Jesus gave us access to Yahweh. Because of Jesus, we have access to God. See, before, God would dwell in the Ark of the Covenant, which was placed in the Holy of Holies in the temple. So only a select number of people could go into the temple, but we have access to Yahweh because of Jesus Christ. Because of his sacrifice, because of what Jesus did on the cross, we now have access to Yahweh. So as we start this new year in this new series, as we take a look at these I am statements, I hope that we grow closer to Yahweh. Let us pray.